Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is modify. Let's take a moment and review some of the definitions or the ways that we can use this verb. The first way you might hear modify used is to mean to make a partial or minor change to something in order to improve it or make it better. Another related definition for the verb modify is to alter or change the form or character of something. A third way we use modify can mean to make something less extreme or severe or even not as strong. When I think about this third definition, I think of people's opinions on many different issues. And many times through reading or life experiences, our views on a particular subject modify. They might seem less severe or strong. We start to see, oh my goodness, there are lots of shades of gray. Maybe things aren't as black and white as they might seem. Sometimes with that make less extreme, you'll also hear it used in connection to laws or regulations. Now, a fourth way you might hear modify used is very specific to grammar. So we use this word modify sometimes to describe certain words or phrases where we qualify or limit their meaning. I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the video. But for now, you should know that modify is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing to form modifying. The past tense and participle forms of our verb can be made by adding ed. But here, our word modify ends with a consonant and a Y. So this is going to require a spelling change. We're going to drop the Y, add an I, and then the ED ending. And that's going to make modified. You might be noticing as I say modified, right? I'm just adding a D sound to the end of the word. That is because modify ends with a vowel sound, and vowel sounds are always voiced. You'll also notice I'm not adding an extra syllable to the word as I'm saying it. So I'm not saying id, I'm just saying duh, modified. Okay? You might be relieved to know there are no phrasal verbs for us to discuss today, so instead, we'll focus on making some example sentences with our verb of the day. Today, we're going to practice making sentences in the simple past tense and the simple present. We'll start with the past tense. We use this verb tense to talk about completed actions at a known point in the past. Sometimes our sentences in the simple past tense have time signals. These could be words like yesterday or last week, last month, even a specific date or time in the past. But not every sentence that is using the simple past tense will have a time signal. That can be implied as part of a larger passage or as part of a conversation. The nice thing about making simple past tense sentences is that our structure stays the same no matter what our subject is. So in the affirmative, I start with my subject and then I use that ed form of the verb. You can see this in my example. Two scientists modified mRNA and it enabled the development of effective vaccines against COVID-19. So this sentence is maybe a little difficult to understand because it is very science focused here. And this is a true sentence. The two scientists were recently honored with one of the most prestigious awards, the Nobel Prize. And their work was to make these small changes to messenger RNA. And their work led to really rapid development of new types of vaccines. Now let's talk about making negative simple past tense sentences. To do this, I start with my subject, I use did not, and then the base verb. Notice I'm not using the ed form of the verb here. An example of this might be, I didn't modify the recipe from the cookbook at all. Right? So I'm saying here, I did not make any changes. I followed that recipe down to the most specific steps, right? Finally, let's talk about making a yes or no question in the simple past tense. To do this, I start with did, I have my subject, and then the base verb. Again, I am not using the ed form of the verb in my yes or no question. I'm only using that ed form in the affirmative or positive sentences. Let's take a look at a yes or no question. Did the transportation authority modify bus schedules? Okay. Let's move on now and talk about sentences in the simple present. We use the simple present to discuss our habits and routines. These are actions that tend to repeat with a known frequency. Now, we also use the simple present to talk about facts. And my first example here is going to be a fact. But first, let's talk about how we make sentences in the positive or the affirmative. Here, it is very important for us to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, I use the base verb. Okay? But if my subject is he, she, or it, then what I'm going to do is, again, drop my Y, add an I, and then ES. That makes my what's called the third person singular here. So let's take a look at an example sentence. My example sentence says, the clause who is a lawyer modifies the noun neighbor in the sentence, my neighbor who is a lawyer works downtown. This sentence is going to connect back to that fourth definition, that very specific grammar definition where we use modify. So here, the noun neighbor is being limited by the phrase or clause, who is a lawyer. Okay? And here, the clause is just one, so you can see I've changed my verb where I've dropped the Y and I've added IES. Now, let's move on and talk about making sentences, negative sentences in the simple present. To do this, again, I pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, I use do, not, and then the base verb. If my subject is he, she, or it, I use does not, and then the base verb. You can see that in my example. Statin use does not modify flu vaccine effectiveness. Okay? I was looking for real examples and I saw a number of sentences or examples, articles talking about how certain medications might affect, or not affect in this case, other medicines or vaccines in this case. So here, the particular article I borrowed from is saying this one type of medicine does not make a vaccine really less effective. It doesn't change it. Now let's move on and talk about making a yes or no question in the simple present. To do this, I start with do or does, whichever form matches my subject. That subject comes next. Then you're going to see the base verb. I always like to point out to students, notice the only time I'm using the IES ending on the verb is in the affirmative. I'm not using it with the negative or my yes or no question. Let's take a look at that last example. Does this judge modify child custody orders very often? This is another place you might run into the word modify more regularly in connection to the law. Sometimes people will talk about modifying contracts. This word can have a more formal sort of sound to it. So I thought that might be a good example for us to have. Now, let's move on and talk about some words that are related to our verb modify. And the first word we're going to discuss is the noun modification. The noun modification can have a couple different meanings. We're going to talk about two of them. The first is just to describe the action of modifying something or changing something. An example of this might be, these new parts should work with just a few modifications. So we might imagine we have some type of machine, we have these replacement parts, but we're going to have to make some small changes in order to get them to work inside of this machine. Now, a second way to use the noun modification is to refer to the change that has already been made. An example of this: there will be several modifications to the work schedule next week. Again, I could say this sentence: there will be several changes to the work schedule next week, and it would really have about the same meaning. Let's talk about another related word. It's the noun modifier. This can also have a couple different meanings. The first is to describe a person or a thing that makes some kind of small or minor changes to something. An example of this might be, the app says it uses music to be a mood modifier. Right? Our mood, our feelings, kind of our state of being. I read about something recently that you can answer questions, or even phones might be looking at things you're searching or looking at and realizing, oh, this person is very sad. Maybe they need some happier, more uplifting music. And that's what they're talking about, trying to make a small change to how someone feels. Now, another way you might encounter the word modifier is, again, very specific to English grammar. You might hear your teacher use it. So when we talk about the noun modifier, we're generally describing a word that restricts or adds to the sense of another word or phrase. I've got an example here. This, that, these, and those are examples of modifiers. And this is very much a true sentence. Adjectives and adverbs are another good example of modifiers. They either limit or sort of add to a meaning of a noun or a verb, as in, or other phrase as well. One last word for us today, and it's the adjective modifiable. Modifiable means able to be modified. This could be in form, it could be in character, it could be in strength, right? So this is something we're able to change. An example of this might be, the cardiovascular disease risk factors of blood pressure and cholesterol are modifiable. So this sentence might be a little difficult to understand, but again, I wanted to find a real example of how you might hear this used. So many of us, through our family history, might have a chance of having heart disease. And there might not be a lot we can change about that past history, or the genes that have been passed to us. But there are some things we can do to lower our risk factors. And so making sure our blood pressure doesn't get too high, or that our cholesterol levels are not too high, these are things that we can control, or we can make small improvements to. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.